Most people assume revolutions happen when the poor get desperate enough to storm the barricades. The data tells a different story. Political systems don't collapse from the bottom up. They fracture from the top down. Here's the puzzle. States fail when elite classes split apart, not when masses starve. The French Revolution didn't start with peasants. It started when nobles stopped paying taxes and blocked reforms. The fall of Rome began when senators murdered each other in the Forum, not when slaves revolted. Today we're examining the mechanism connecting economic disparity to state failure. We'll use Peter Turchin's structural demographic theory as our lens. The framework tracks three vectors of pressure: population stress, elite overproduction, and state fiscal collapse. When these three forces align, systems break. To understand this, we need to see how inequality loads a social system like structural weight on a bridge. The damage accumulates invisibly. Then one day, what looks like a sudden collapse was actually decades in the making. How inequality loads the system. Think of a bridge. Engineers calculate load limits based on the structure's capacity. Add weight gradually and nothing seems wrong. But stress fractures form in the supports. One day a truck crosses and the whole thing comes down. Observers call it sudden. The engineers knew it was inevitable. Economic inequality works the same way. It loads the system through three distinct mechanisms. The first component is what researchers call the wealth pump. Returns on assets systematically outpace wage growth. If you own capital, your wealth compounds. If you sell labor, your income stagnates. This isn't a moral judgment. It's a mathematical reality in certain economic conditions. The mechanism transfers wealth from producers to asset owners. Small farmers can't compete with industrial agriculture. Local shops can't match Amazon's prices. Wages stay flat while housing costs double. The pump runs continuously, concentrating resources at the top while hollowing out the middle. This creates what Turchin calls a reservoir of resentment. People work harder for less. They watch their parents' standard of living become unreachable. The social contract, that implicit deal where effort leads to security, starts feeling like a lie. This alone doesn't cause revolution, but it creates the fuel. The second component is elite overproduction, and this is the primary driver of instability. The economy creates more millionaires every year. Universities graduate more credentialed professionals. But the number of high-status positions remains relatively fixed. There are only so many Senate seats, CEO roles, tenured professorships, or spots on corporate boards. You end up with musical chairs where the stakes are life and death. Too many elites competing for too few positions. In stable times, ambitious people who don't make it into the top tier accept their fate. They become comfortable professionals. But when elite competition intensifies, those shut out of power don't go quietly. This triggers intra-elite competition. Political rivals stop being opponents you debate and become existential threats you must destroy. The norms that kept conflict civilized dissolve. Counter-elites, those ambitious actors blocked from power, stop playing by the rules. They look for ways to overturn the game board entirely. The third component is fiscal resistance. As wealth concentrates, those holding it gain the influence to avoid taxation. They hire lobbyists, they find loopholes, they move assets offshore. The state starves of resources exactly when the population is angriest and most in need of services. Government loses the capacity to govern. It can't buy off the poor with social programs. It can't suppress disorder because police and military funding gets cut. It can't invest in infrastructure or education. The state becomes a hollow shell, powerful on paper but paralyzed in practice. Here's where these three mechanisms create a fatal feedback loop. You have a broke state that can't respond to crises. You have fractured elites fighting each other instead of cooperating. You have a faithless population that's lost trust in institutions. The system enters paralysis. The broke state can't mediate elite conflicts or address popular grievances. Fractured elites block each other's reforms and weaponize popular anger against rivals. The resentful population becomes a tool that counter-elites use to attack the establishment. Each component makes the others worse. This abstract mechanism becomes concrete when we examine historical cases. The pattern repeats across wildly different societies and eras, which suggests we're looking at something structural, not coincidental. Let's watch this mechanism play out in three different societies, separated by centuries and continents. Same underlying pattern, different historical costumes. Start with the late Roman Republic around 133 BC. Rome had just conquered the Mediterranean world. Wealth flooded into the city, but it didn't spread evenly. Generals and senators claimed conquered lands. They built massive estates called latifundia, worked entirely by slave labor from the wars. The wealth pump ran at full speed. Small Roman farmers couldn't compete with free slave labor. They'd spent years fighting in Rome's armies. They came home to find their farms failing or bought out by aristocrats. The citizen farmer class that had built Rome collapsed into an urban mob of landless poor. Elite fracture came next. The Senate was packed with the same landowners profiting from this system. When the Gracchus brothers, themselves aristocrats, proposed redistributing public land to restore the small farmer class, the Senate saw it as theft. Tiberius Gracchus broke protocol by bypassing Senate approval and taking his law directly to the People's Assembly. Here's the breaking point. The Senate, led by the Pontifex Maximus, grabbed wooden benches and clubs. They beat Tiberius Gracchus to death on the steps of the Capitol, along with 300 of his supporters. This was the moment comedy died. For centuries, Roman elites had settled disputes through debate and procedure. Now, political murder was on the table. The agreement to solve disputes without violence was gone. Tiberius's brother Gaius tried even more radical reforms a decade later. The Senate killed him too. After the Gracchi, a generation of ambitious generals realized the path to power ran through private armies, not Senate votes. Marius, Sulla, Pompey, Caesar. Each commanded legions loyal to them personally, not to the state. The Republic tore itself apart in civil wars until Augustus imposed imperial rule. Move forward to Weimar Germany in the 1920s and early 30s. Different era, same pattern. The wealth pump here was hyperinflation followed by depression. The 1923 inflation wiped out middle-class savings, while industrialists with real assets got richer. Then the 1929 crash brought 30% unemployment. Workers and the middle class were crushed, while a small elite remained protected. Fiscal resistance came from the Junkers, the Prussian landed aristocracy. The government created the Osthilfe program to bail out their failing estates. The Junkers diverted these funds to buy luxury cars, racehorses, and vacation homes on the Riviera instead of paying debts. President Hindenburg's own family was implicated in tax evasion schemes. When Chancellor Brüning threatened to expose this corruption and redistribute bankrupt estates to unemployed workers, the Junkers acted. They convinced Hindenburg to fire Brüning and later his successor, Schleicher. The breaking point came when they persuaded Hindenburg to appoint Hitler as chancellor. They thought they could control him. They were wrong. But their calculation was clear. Better to risk Hitler than lose their land. Elite fracture had created a negative coalition. Nazis and communists together held a majority in parliament, making democratic governance impossible. The old elites chose to dismantle democracy entirely rather than accept reforms that would cost them their privileges. Weimar didn't fall to a popular uprising. It was euthanized by its own ruling class. Jump to post-Soviet Russia in the 1990s. The wealth pump was shock therapy privatization. State assets worth billions were sold for pennies to connected insiders. A handful of men became oligarchs overnight, while hyperinflation vaporized ordinary Russian savings. GDP collapsed by nearly half. 32 million people fell below the poverty line. Elite fracture was immediate and violent. The new oligarchs fought turf wars with car bombs and assassinations. The state couldn't collect taxes because the oligarchs simply refused to pay. By 1996, 7 bankers controlled half the economy and the major media networks. They called themselves the Semibankirshina, the rule of 7 bankers. The breaking point came in 1993. President Yeltsin and Parliament deadlocked over economic reforms. Yeltsin illegally dissolved Parliament. Parliament voted to remove Yeltsin. The standoff ended when Yeltsin ordered tanks to shell the Parliament building. Nearly 150 people died. Democracy was murdered in broad daylight to protect the privatization winners. The 1993 Constitution was written to create a super presidency strong enough to enforce economic inequality against popular will. When Putin took power in 2000, he offered a new deal: accept autocracy in exchange for order and rising incomes. A population exhausted by the chaos of inequality accepted. 3 different societies, 3 different time periods, but watch the pattern. Masses provide the fuel through their justified resentment. Fractured elites provide the match by weaponizing that resentment against each other. The state, starved of resources and legitimacy, can't contain the fire. Knowing the pattern lets us identify early warning signs before systems break completely. The first symptom is breakdown of comity. Political rivals start getting treated as criminals or existential threats rather than legitimate opponents. In Rome, it was the murder of the Gracchi. In modern terms, it's when normal political losses feel like life or death outcomes. Politics stops being debate and becomes legal warfare, social warfare, cultural warfare. Norms get shattered for short-term tactical victories. The second symptom is blockade politics. Concentrated wealth gains effective veto power over state action. Obvious reforms that would benefit the majority get stalled for decades. The system enters paralysis. The state has theoretical power, but lacks political capacity to use it. In Rome, the Senate blocked land reform. In Weimar, the Junkers blocked agricultural reform. In Russia, the oligarchs blocked tax collection. The third symptom is demand for a fixer. The public loses faith that normal institutions can solve problems. They stop believing voting or legislation will change anything. They start looking for a strong man who can bypass the deadlock and smash the system that's failing them. This is how Caesar, Hitler, and Putin all rose. They were answers to gridlock. There's also what's called the Tocqueville effect. Revolutions often happen not when things are worst, but when they improve slightly or when expectations get crushed. People can endure poverty if they've always known poverty. But give them hope, then take it away? That gap between what was promised and what's delivered generates explosive force. This brings us to the core lesson. Political instability is the market correction for structural inequality that politics failed to address. The wealth pump creates pressure. Elite fracture breaks containment. The explosion follows. If you want to understand where a society is heading, don't just watch the gap between rich and poor. Watch how elites treat each other. When they stop playing by shared rules, when blocking a rival becomes more important than governing, the game is already over. Once elites fracture, the masses become weapons in their civil war. Subscribe for more structured analysis designed for the curious analyst.